We are snowed in here in New York. Completely snowed in. Flights grounded, streets frozen, time slowed down in that strange way it only does when nature forces you to sit still and think. And maybe that's exactly why this conversation needs to happen now, because when everything goes quiet, the truth gets louder. I can't go anywhere. I can't move. So all I can really do is sit here, reflect, and talk to you. And today, I want to talk about something deeply uncomfortable, but very necessary. An article came out recently from Scalawag magazine, and in it, they made a prediction that stopped me in my tracks, not because it was shocking, but because it felt painfully familiar. The article predicts that when Sean Diddy Combs eventually leaves prison, he will return to the entertainment industry. Not quietly, not in shame, but openly, strategically, and most disturbingly, successfully. They believe he will be welcomed back. And before anyone reacts emotionally, before anyone says that could never happen, I want you, especially those of you who've lived long enough to remember patterns, to sit with that for a moment. Because history tells us something very clear. Powerful men rarely disappear. They just rebrand. What this article argues, and what I agree with, is that nothing meaningful has been done to dismantle the cultural, institutional, and financial systems that allowed Diddy's behavior to flourish in the first place. And if those systems are still standing, still functioning, still rewarding the same kinds of men, then why would Diddy be any different? We've seen this story before. Over and over again. Different faces. Same script. The entertainment industry is filled with men who have harmed women, abused power, silenced victims, and yet continue to be celebrated, awarded, platformed, and protected. Not despite their history, but often in spite of it. Dr. Dre is a prime example. Chris Brown is another. The list goes on and on and on. So when people say, Diddy will never come back, I have to ask, based on what evidence? Because if incarceration were enough to end a powerful man's influence, we wouldn't be having this conversation at all. The article explains this carefully and honestly, uncomfortably well. It doesn't rely on hope. It relies on precedent. It reminds us that when very little has been done to challenge the structures that enabled abuse, then re-entry becomes not just possible, but likely. Diddy will not return as the same man. Of course not. That version is gone. But he won't need it. He will return rebranded. He will return softer, slower, more apologetic, more reflective. He will speak the language of accountability without fully embracing it. He will say he has changed, that prison transformed him, that he has found peace, faith, clarity, growth. And many people will want to believe him, because Americans love a comeback story, especially older Americans. We've been raised on redemption arcs, on the idea that time served equals debt paid, that punishment equals closure, that once someone has done their time, we're supposed to move on. But here's the hard truth. Prison does not dismantle power. It pauses it. Diddy will still have money, substantial money, somewhere between $100 and $200 million. That alone ensures access to publicists, image consultants, lawyers, strategists, media allies, access to silence, access to spin. Money buys patience. Money buys second chances. Money buys amnesia. The article predicts, and I agree, that while Diddy will never return to the peak of his former dominance, he does not need to. He doesn't need to be untouchable again. He just needs to be present. And from presence comes normalization. Slowly, subtly, he will re-enter the spaces that once rejected him. A podcast appearance here. A controlled interview there. Carefully chosen hosts. Friendly faces. No hostile questions. No real accountability. Just enough regret to soothe the audience. And the blogs will help. They always do. The Shade Room. Industry gossip pages. Celebrity platforms that thrive on engagement, not ethics. One post at a time, the door opens. And once the door opens, it never fully closes again. This is not pessimism. This is pattern recognition. We've seen men convicted, accused, exposed, only to return stronger, wealthier, and more insulated than before. Because the industry does not run on morality. It runs on profit. And abusive men, especially powerful ones, are profitable. That's the part people don't like to say out loud. When nothing has been done to dismantle the system protects itself. And Diddy is a product of that system, a beneficiary of it, a reflection of it. So why would it suddenly reject him? The article draws comparisons to others, men currently imprisoned, men previously convicted, men who faced backlash only to resurface years later. And every comparison leads to the same conclusion. Punishment is temporary. Power is patient. This is why the prediction feels so believable. Because it doesn't ask us to imagine a better world. It asks us to remember the one we're actually living in. And for those of you watching who are 65 and older, you've lived through Watergate, through OJ, through Clinton, through decades of men falling and rising again. You know how this goes. You've seen apologies that meant nothing. You've seen accountability theater. You've seen how quickly outrage fades. That's why this conversation matters. Because this isn't just about Diddy. It's about what happens when a society confuses punishment with justice. And we're only just getting started. There is something deeply unsettling about watching history repeat itself. Especially when you're old enough to recognize the pattern before the ending arrives. Many of you listening right now have seen this play out more times than you can count. Different decade, different headline, same outcome. Because what we are really talking about here is not one man. We're talking about a system. And systems do not go to prison. People do. The entertainment industry, the music industry in particular, has always been structured to protect power, not challenge it. It rewards silence. It punishes truth. And it trains everyone inside it to look the other way as long as the money keeps flowing. That is why the article's prediction about Diddy's return doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels inevitable. Let's be honest about something that rarely gets said out loud. The industry never actually rejected Diddy. It paused him. It distanced itself publicly while maintaining quiet loyalty privately. There is a difference. When a powerful man falls, the industry doesn't ask, "How do we prevent this from happening again?" It asks, "How long do we need to wait before this becomes profitable again?" That waiting period is already happening. Behind closed doors, conversations are being had. Calculations are being made. Publicists are planning timelines. Lawyers are advising on optics. Not morality, optics. And that's because nothing structural has changed. No major institutions were dismantled. No gatekeepers lost power. No financial backers faced consequences. No executives were held accountable for what they enabled. The machinery remains intact. So when Diddy eventually steps back into the public eye, he won't be entering a hostile environment. He will be returning to familiar ground, an industry that understands him, protects him, and benefits from his existence. People often ask, but what about the backlash? Yes, there will be backlash. There always is. But backlash in America has an expiration date. Outrage is loud, but it is also temporary. And powerful men know this. They wait it out. They let the noise die down. They let public attention shift. They let another scandal take center stage. And once the crowd moves on, they return, carefully, strategically, quietly at first. This is where the comparison to other men in the industry becomes important. Take Chris Brown. Years of documented violence. Public incidents. Court cases. Apologies that came and went. And yet he still tours. He still sells records. He still has defenders. Why? Because the system decided he was still profitable. Dr. Dre is another example. Public knowledge. Open history. And yet, recently honored, celebrated, awarded, praised as a legend. What message does that send? It sends a very clear one. Talent excuses harm. Success erases violence. Time heals reputations, not victims. So when people say, Diddy will never be accepted again, I have to ask, accepted by whom? The public? The industry doesn't need public approval. It needs enough silence to proceed. And silence is easy to manufacture, especially when fear is involved. Let's talk about fear for a moment. Because fear is one of the most powerful tools the system uses. People will still be afraid of Diddy when he gets out of prison. Afraid of his money. Afraid of his connections. Afraid of retaliation, social, professional, financial. Afraid of being isolated, blacklisted, or quietly erased. Power doesn't disappear just because someone is incarcerated. It goes underground, and Diddy understands power better than most. He understands how to intimidate without speaking, how to punish without touching, how to send messages without leaving fingerprints. That fear alone will silence many people who might otherwise speak out. It already has. And that is why so many survivors never come forward. Because they watch what happens to those who do. They watched Cassie. They watched the jokes. The mockery. The disbelief. The cruelty. The way her trauma became entertainment. The way her pain was dissected, debated, doubted. They watched how long it took for people to believe her. And they learned a lesson. That speaking up does not guarantee justice. It often guarantees re-traumatization. That is why the vast majority of abuse remains unreported. Not because it doesn't happen, but because the cost of telling the truth is too high. And this is not limited to Diddy. Look across the landscape. Look at how many men accused of abuse continue to move freely, continue to date, continue to profit, continue to be protected. Look at how grooming, power imbalances, and exploitation are routinely minimized, excused, or ignored. There are cases, public documented cases, where adults engaged in relationships with minors, where power dynamics were clear, where harm was undeniable, and yet no real consequences. No outrage, no industry reckoning, no lasting backlash. So why would Diddy be different? Why would the system suddenly grow a conscience? It won't. And that's the hardest truth to accept. Because it means the problem is bigger than any one trial, any one conviction, any one sentence. The justice system itself was never designed to deliver true justice to the powerful. It was designed to manage them, to contain outrage, to offer symbolic gestures, to create the appearance of accountability without threatening the status quo. Judges can say the right things. Courts can acknowledge harm. Sentences can be handed down. But symbolism does not change material reality. And material reality is this. When Diddy walks free, he will walk back into a world that still knows how to protect him. He will not be welcomed by everyone. But he doesn't need everyone. He just needs enough. Enough platforms. Enough allies. Enough silence. And he will find it. Because the system always makes room for men like him. There is a machine in America that very few people like to acknowledge, even though we've all watched it operate our entire lives. It is quiet at first, patient, methodical, and once it starts moving, it is almost impossible to stop. It's called the comeback machine. This machine does not run on truth. It does not run on justice. It runs on fatigue, on forgetfulness, on the human desire to move on, especially when moving on is more comfortable than reckoning with what actually happened. And this is where Diddy's return, if and when it happens, becomes less about him and more about us. Because the machine only works when the audience lets it. Here's how it begins. Not with music. Not with concerts. Not with Madison Square Garden. It begins with sympathy. You'll hear phrases like, he's paid his debt to society. Prison changes people. We're all human. At some point, we have to allow redemption. These statements sound reasonable, compassionate even, and for a generation raised to believe in forgiveness, they land softly. But what they conveniently ignore is this. Redemption without accountability is just reputation management. And reputation management is exactly what Diddy will pursue. He will not come back angry. He will not come back defiant. He will come back humbled, at least in appearance. Softer language, measured tone, carefully rehearsed remorse. You will see him sit across from familiar faces. Friendly interviewers. People who owe him favors. People who understand the rules of silence. There will be no tough questions. No sustained focus on victims. No uncomfortable pauses. Instead, there will be reflection. Talk of growth. Talk of pain. Talk of spirituality. Talk of family. And slowly the narrative will shift. From what did he do? To what did prison do to him? From the harm he caused to the hardship he endured. That shift is critical. Because once the focus moves from victims to the abuser's emotional journey, the door is open. And the blogs will help. They always do. One photo at a time. One headline at a time. One carefully framed story. No context. No reminders. Just nostalgia. Remember this era? A legend reflects. A complicated figure. Complicated is the industry's favorite word. It allows celebration without accountability. Then come the allies. This is where it becomes undeniable. There will be celebrities who step forward. Not loudly, not all at once, but gradually. A comment here. A like there. A subtle show of support. Kanye West is a perfect example of how this works. Kanye has always gravitated toward men who have been ostracized. Not because they are innocent, but because their rejection feeds his own narrative of persecution. He sees himself in them, not as abusers, but as misunderstood geniuses. When Kanye publicly supported Diddy's family, when he positioned himself as a caretaker, it wasn't just kindness. It was alignment, and alignment opens doors. Others will follow. Not Jay-Z, not Beyoncé. They will keep their distance. They understand optics better than most. But there are many others, less powerful, less cautious, more reckless, who will step in. And once enough recognizable faces appear alongside Diddy, the public conversation shifts again. From should he be here? To well, if they're okay with it. This is how normalization happens. Not through argument, but through exposure. And once exposure becomes routine, resistance weakens. especially among younger audiences who did not live through the full context, who did not witness the build-up, who only know fragments. But for older viewers, those of you who remember how quickly narratives change, you can already see where this is heading. You've watched men fall and rise again before. You watched it with politicians, with entertainers, with religious leaders, with CEOs. You watched public outrage burn hot, and then burn out. And you learned something important. America has a short memory when power is involved. This is devastating for survivors, because while the world moves on, they don't get to. They carry the harm forward. They carry the consequences. They carry the scars, physical, emotional, psychological. And every time their abuser is celebrated again, it reopens the wound. It tells them their pain was temporary, but his career is permanent. That is why so many survivors stay silent. Not because they lack courage, but because they've learned what courage costs. They've learned that even when they speak, even when they are believed, even when there is a conviction, the ending rarely belongs to them. The comeback machine does not care about them. It cares about profitability. And Diddy will be profitable again. Not immediately. Not universally. But enough. Enough to justify the risk. Enough to make the system comfortable. And once the system is comfortable, the floodgates open. A podcast becomes a speaking tour. A speaking tour becomes a documentary. A documentary becomes a reintroduction. A reintroduction becomes a performance. And before you know it, he's back in the spaces that once rejected him, standing under bright lights, applauded by crowds who have been trained to forget. This is not speculation. This is history. And it keeps happening because we allow symbolism to replace substance. We allow statements to replace change. We allow time to replace accountability. And the machine keeps moving. There comes a point in every long life when optimism begins to give way to recognition. Not cynicism, recognition. The kind that only comes from watching the same story unfold again and again, just with new names and different faces. For many of you listening, this is not your first reckoning with disappointment. You have watched movements rise and fall. You have watched promises made and broken. You have watched institutions claim reform while quietly protecting the same people they always have. And that is why this final truth may be the hardest to accept, but also the most honest. Justice in America stops where power begins. It always has. The Diddy trial, like so many celebrity trials before it, did not expose a broken system. It confirmed a functioning one. A system designed not to deliver justice, but to manage outrage, preserve hierarchy, and protect the status quo. When a judge speaks powerfully about abuse, about emotional, psychological, and physical harm, it feels meaningful. It feels like progress. It feels like acknowledgement. But words do not dismantle systems. They soothe consciences. And while symbolism matters, it does not change material reality. Material reality is this. Diddy will leave prison with money, influence, and a network still intact. He will not leave broken. He will leave bruised, but still powerful. And power, once accumulated, does not evaporate. It waits. It recalibrates. It returns. That is why people will still fear him when he gets out. Not because of who he was, but because of who he still is. A man with resources. A man with reach. A man with the capacity to retaliate quietly and effectively. People who testified against him will carry that fear with them. Not paranoia, experience. They know how power moves. They know how revenge doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it comes through isolation, through lost opportunities, through whispered warnings. And unless there is another indictment, another legal reckoning, nothing will stop him from reasserting that power. This is not about vengeance. It's about patterns. And the pattern tells us that abusive men who retain wealth and connections are rarely finished. They adapt. They evolve. They learn the language of accountability without internalizing it. They perform remorse. They weaponize forgiveness. And society helps them do it. Because society is uncomfortable sitting with unresolved harm. We prefer closure, even false closure, to ongoing discomfort. So we tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves that prison rehabilitates. That time heals. That people change. And sometimes they do. But systems don't. The same industry that rewarded Diddy before will reward him again. Not because it believes he is innocent, but because it believes he is useful. And usefulness outweighs morality every time. This is why survivors watch these trials and feel despair rather than hope. Because they understand something the public often refuses to see. Accountability is selective. It is handed out sparingly. And it almost never threatens power at its root. That is why so much abuse goes unreported. Not because people don't want justice, but because they don't believe it exists for them. They watch what happens to those who speak. They watch the ridicule, the scrutiny, the character assassination. They watch as their abusers eventually regain platforms, praise, and protection. And they decide silence is safer. This is not a failure of courage. It is a survival strategy. And until the systems that protect abusers are dismantled, not rebranded, not reworded, not temporarily paused, this cycle will continue. Diddy is not an anomaly. He is an example of what happens when power is allowed to regenerate unchecked. When consequences are framed as detours rather than endpoints. And that is why his comeback plan, whether formally written or not, is one to watch. Not because it is clever, but because it is familiar. It will happen slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, like water dripping against stone. And one day, people will wake up and realize he is back in the room. And many will ask, how did this happen? The answer will be simple. Nothing changed. The structures remained. The incentives stayed the same. And justice stopped exactly where it always does, at the power line. That is not pessimism. That is realism. And realism, especially for those who have lived long enough to recognize it, is not cruelty, it is clarity. So when people ask why Diddy might return, why the doors might reopen, why the industry might embrace him again, the answer is not complicated. Because it always has. Because it was built to. And until we are willing to confront that truth, not just emotionally, but structurally, this will not be the last time we have this conversation. Not by a long shot.